Thanks, Tom. And let's see. Yeah. It was not as promised. Here we are. And I'd like to thank everybody at Esri for giving us the opportunity to come here and speak with you all. It's wonderful to be here, and such a great crowd we have. What I'd like to talk to you about today is our efforts in reaching out to local governments to understand what are the challenges facing them. Traditionally, my company has done a lot of work with regional planning agencies and with state departments of transportation. And that's not surprising because that's where most of the action happens, quite frankly, in transportation planning. We wanted to understand better what we could do to assist local governments, because plans are made at the regional and the state level, but implementation happens at the local level. So what are the challenges facing these local governments? Let's take a look. What we heard from them is there are some cities that are growing, which is great news. It's a good problem to have. But the problem with growth is you have to evaluate it. You have to decide whether it's the kind of growth that you want. You have to decide where to put it, which proposals to accept, which ones need mitigation or revision in order to be acceptable for your city's long-term vision and strategy. Just because there's an economic recovery going on doesn't mean we just accept everything. And then there are the cities that could use a little more growth and may be dealing with negative perceptions. If it's an urban community, they may be dealing with a perception of safety risk, either crime or traffic accidents, things like that. And then the more ex-urban communities, the ones with lots of suburban development, may be facing perceptions of sprawl. And they may actually have more urban amenities than people realize. So they're dealing with these negative perceptions, and cities are trying to retrofit their landscape. One way to deal with these negative perceptions is to do something about it. If there is a real problem with the landscape, change it. And a lot of cities are trying to do that and sketching out ambitious infrastructure plans to try to address those perceptions. But there's another way to deal with those negative perceptions, which is really to communicate with data. And this is part of something that cities really need to do in order to stay competitive. Cities compete for development with their local neighbors as well as with other metro regions and other cities around the world. It is global economy. So a lot of cities are waking up and they're realizing that they need to become more data-driven in order to communicate to the stakeholders locally as well as the people they're trying to bring into the city, the growth they want to bring into the city, what their key assets are, or what the value of that location is. Well, so that's what a lot of people in local government seem to be focusing on, but we think they're actually missing a really key performance measure. And it's wonderful that there are things like Green Score and all of these new performance-based planning indicators coming out. But what we're finding is that there is an underlying performance measure that ties together transportation and land use and really speaks to the bottom line of cities and local government. And it's called accessibility. And I'm glad David mentioned sustainability and the triple bottom line of social, economic, and environmental. I'm mostly going to talk about economic bottom line in my presentation, but as you'll see as we go through some examples, these things really speak to the other two as well. Accessibility planning really helps local governments connect residents and businesses with the destinations they care about, and this will improve their bottom line from the point of view of economic development, business attraction, luring jobs in, revenue generation, grant fundraising, and regulatory compliance. And we know about other countries' traditions in accessibility planning, so I'd just like to kind of relate this back to what it could mean for US local government. From talking to our customers who are consultants in economic development, we know the top factors for business location are access to transportation hubs like airports, transit stations, universities for that skilled, intelligent knowledge worker labor force. Access to hospitals is a key thing. And just in general, understanding the composition of the labor force within a site's market area. The top factors for retail site selection are going to include trade area size, population within 20 minutes, for example, and the population characteristics of that trade area. And Esri has built some fantastic tools for being able to measure and understand these things. What we're not seeing enough of is other modes being considered here, transit, pedestrians, bicycles, as we look at increasingly urban locations being where the real opportunities are, because that's where today's knowledge workers want to be, especially the younger generation. and they want a lifestyle that doesn't make them dependent on their car. We're hearing that both from a site selection point of view and business location, people just don't have the data and tools they need to be able to evaluate competing locations. So that's one side of that. That's sort of bringing in jobs. And then the other side is more residential. And property taxes and revenues, which is a key part of local government revenue, is property taxes. Those are intrinsically linked to property values, as we saw during the housing crisis, because decreases in property values affected budgets. But what we're seeing coming out of that is that there's really strongest demand for housing in neighborhoods where residents can walk for their daily errands. And this is quantified. There have been lots of studies of this, using existing walkability scores to show that if you improve walkability in a significant amount, you can get a measurable, quantifiable uplift in property values. So this is good for communities, good for public health, good for the environment, but it also speaks again to that economic bottom line. And by the way, from our own studies where we've done land use forecasting models, and we've had to estimate the utility functions for what both non-residential and residential agents value and what they look for when they're choosing a location, this is robust across all demographic and income groups. So this is really measurable. But taking it out of the model and the forecasting and the long range and the quantitative studies, I'd just like to make this personal for a second and tell you about a friend of mine named Kevin. So Kevin lives in the town I used to live in. He's a former competitive long-distance bicyclist, and he now volunteers for his town's bicycle advisory committee, and he wants to bike his kids to school. He has this rather nifty little cargo bike, and he's got 2 kids sitting in there, helmets on, thank goodness. I don't know why Kevin doesn't have a helmet on in that picture. I need to have a word with Kevin about that. Because his primary concern about doing this is safety, really. You know, his personal experience of trying to bike his kids to school on the town's recommended route is that it's extremely stressful because there's so much traffic. And so his volunteer committee had been in a dialogue with the town's engineers about this when we got to know Kevin and his committee, and we noticed that the dialogue was not very data-driven. It was all about, you know, their personal experience and the town's kind of accumulated knowledge and assumed kind of engineering-based understanding of where bike routes should go. So we thought, well, what can we do to help? And Jack has always said so much about how GIS can provide a common language in these kinds of situations. So we happen to be prototyping a new technology for estimating traffic volume and congestion on all streets in major cities called Streetlytics. We thought, can we leverage this database to actually calculate bicycle stress for Kevin's committee and show that to the town engineers? And the town engineers were delighted with the idea. They had tried to do it, but they just simply didn't have the data, whereas we have traffic volumes on every street. So we showed this map to Kevin's committee, and they said, boy, that looks an awful lot like a map of our town's recommended bike routes. They had put the bike routes on exactly the highest volume streets. But it's just not having the data. It's not that these two parties fundamentally disagreed on objectives. They actually had the same objectives in mind, but they'd never seen a map like this. So, and then the next step is to look at where are the schools and are there safe routes to those schools? Can we get people to school by bicycling? And by the way, safe routes to school, I use that phrase because it's a grant fundraising opportunity. And one of the things that's happened through Kevin's volunteer efforts, his community is now a bronze American League of Bicyclists community, and they've won grants from the state and their regional planning committee to change this. Speaking of those grants, if you get money from the federal government, and that's a great way to boost your town's revenues, you have to also make sure that the money is being spent wisely and fairly. And this speaks to environmental justice, what in the UK is called social inclusion. In Canada, it's called equity and inclusion. But there are frameworks for this throughout the developed world, which speak to identifying areas of concern where there are historically disadvantaged populations, typically minority and low income, although what minority means gets complicated in states like California and Hawaii and places like that and all around the world, really. And just making sure there isn't a disproportionate distribution of benefits or impacts. The key issues here, in terms of benefits and impacts, is usually access to jobs and basic government services. So let's just take a second to look at how we might apply geodesign to that problem. And this is actually where our solution comes in. We've designed a tool developed a tool for ArcMap and in fact, the whole ArcGIS platform that allows GIS users to create a new what-if scenario by coding a public transit line within ArcGIS and then evaluate the increase in jobs accessible via transit for residents without a car using our cloud computing platform. And then our cloud computing platform creates maps of the results, like this map you see here, where the red area is where you have the most increase in jobs. This is Mountain View. I don't know, we like to use these Silicon Valley cities with lots of exciting companies. We used to have an office in Mountain View, so maybe that's why. And then you can share these web-based maps with stakeholders using ArcGIS Online, using story maps, using all these techniques. So that's kind of an interesting one. And here's some more examples of that approach. This one is Fontana, California. They're not far from here. And one of the things happening in California right now is a change in performance measures used for development review. The old traffic engineering-based level of service approach is on its way out. And it's not clear what the new approach is going to be. What is clear is that the state wants communities to identify transit-oriented development areas, areas that have a focused level of access to transit, and treat those areas somewhat differently from other areas when they evaluate development. How do we identify these areas in the landscape of suburban Southern California? Well, this is one way. We looked at walk access to bus stops within 20 minutes walk in the city of Fontana. And what's interesting about this is that often when you map reality, you discover things you wouldn't have realized otherwise. It's not just one core center that has good transit service. There's multiple locations. It's a more complex geography than this just typical sort of you have your downtown kind of concept. So this pops out at you. Here's another example of that. We met with the city of Bridgeport, and they said, well, we'd really like to be able to identify properties that are underutilized currently and market them for economic development, brownfields properties, vacant properties. But we need to know what we can market about them. And our city's core asset is the fact that it has an urban landscape which is very walkable. So if we can get a walk score for every single parcel in our city, then we can identify underutilized properties that have great walkability, and then we can actually tout that. We can use that to sell the value of the city. Well, when we did this, we kind of discovered almost by accident that there were really two downtowns in Bridgeport. There's the one that you would see on the map where the Bridgeport label is, right? To the left there, the west, the southwest, and that's where the existing train station is. And then if you look over to the east, there's another one. Well, sometimes cities get it right, because this confirmed their intuition about actually where their new train station should go. And they're actually building a new train station. It's confirmed, the governor announced it, over on Barnum Ave in that eastern sort of red splash there. And so this is another thing we've heard as a theme in our meeting with cities, is that they often know through their intuition, but they get into these discussions. If they're lucky, they have the political will to prevail, but it's a lot easier if they have data. And who they increasingly turn to for the data and making the case for what they know is right is their GIS staff and their GIS departments. So this is where geodesign principles can really, really help. So those are just some examples and some themes we've come across in the conversations we've had with cities recently. And we really view this as a partnership. Thinking of scale, it's impossible to know everything you need to know at the global level about the issues and the conversations happening at that local level. So partnerships are needed for organizations and companies that are working nationally and globally to reach out down to the local level and say, what is your data like? What are your issues like? What are your conditions like? What conversations are you having? We need flexible tools that are customizable and tailored using the ArcGIS platform to the local conditions in order to be able to address all these and get back to performance measurement that speaks to that bottom line, that triple bottom line that we're talking about. So thank you very much for your attention, and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you.